Hi, my name is Chris and this is Battle Nonsense. Today we will take a look at the netcode of Quake Champions, which is currently in beta. But first we must talk about a few networking basics which you need to know to understand the results of my tests. The reason why I always include this basic information on YouTube while my patrons can get a cut-to-the-chase version on Vimeo is that on YouTube I must consider that these videos attract new viewers who have never seen such a netcode analysis before, and so they might not know what I mean when I talk about tick rates, update rates or latency. In the past I did not include that basic information in every video. Instead I told my audience to please go to another video first, which did provide that information. Sadly, the comments on these videos and the YouTube analytics showed that no one followed this advice, and as a result many people were either confused by my test results or they just misinterpreted them. So, since I'm only doing these videos to help players to get a better understanding of networking in video games, I decided to always include this basic information when I test a new game or when it's been a long time since the last one. This is really the only way how I can ensure that someone who is new to this gets all the required information. But I didn't forget about those of you who already know the networking basics, so if you don't want to refresh your memory, then you can skip that part of the video with the timecode link that you find in the description down below, as well as in the pinned comment of this video. So let's dive into the networking basics then, where we will start with the ping. Now, what is that and where does the term come from? If you've seen the movie The Hunt for Red October, then you might remember that scene where Sean Connery gave the order to use a single active sonar ping to re-verify their range to the target. The way this works is that your ship or submarine sends out an audio signal, which then gets reflected by other objects in the water. This reflection is then received by microphones or hydrophones installed on your ship, and that then allows you to determine the distance between you and that object by measuring the time between sending the audio signal and receiving the reflection. So when we talk about network connections, then the ping between different devices is pretty much the same thing. Your device sends an ICMP echo request to another network device like a game server, which then sends an ICMP echo reply back to your device. When we then measure the time between sending the request and receiving the answer, then we get the ping or round-trip time of the data. So the ping tells us how long data has to travel through the copper and fiber optic cables to reach the other device. And the longer it takes data to reach its destination, the greater the difference between what we see on our monitor and what the other players see on theirs, which is what we call lag. So when I jump, then it takes some time until that information reaches the server and then the other client. With short distances and good routing between the players and the server, this delay or lag is very low. However, the bigger the distance between the clients and the server, the longer it will take until these receive an update on what is happening. So the higher your ping, the more you will lag, which means that you have a bad experience. But it's not just the player with the high ping that suffers. Depending on how strong the lag compensation is in a game, the player with the high ping can also degrade the experience of players who have a low ping, as these then either receive damage far behind cover or get shot before they can even see the player with the high ping. Developers have tried many different solutions to fix or at least mitigate this issue. Some have tried to use a region lock, but that does not work, as network congestion can cause your ping to go from a stable 20 milliseconds to 300 milliseconds at any time. So what can be done? The brute force solution is to disconnect players who have a ping high enough to cause that issue. However, that will hurt your sales and communities which have members across the globe. DICE uses a quite interesting approach to attack this issue in Battlefield 1, which I want to show you now. Here we have a player with a ping of about 47 milliseconds, let's call him player 1. And then we got the shooter, player 2, who has a ping of about 147 milliseconds. When player 2 now fires at player 1, then the client of player 2 will run the hit registration, which figures out that player 1 has been hit. The client of player 2 then sends this information to the server, which runs its own check to confirm the hit. When the server agrees, then it sends the hit confirmation back to player 2 and the damage data to player 1. This form of hit registration is called client-side server authoritative, because while the client does the hit registration, the server must still confirm the hit or no damage will be dealt. When I then slightly increase the ping of player 2 to about 157 milliseconds, then player 2 gets the aim lead indicator, which tells him that his ping to the server is too high. When player 2 now fires at player 1 again, then the hit will not register anymore, because the hit registration now changed from client-side server authoritative to fully server-side. But when player 2 then leads his shot, which means that he just has to fire a little bit earlier, then the shot registers again. This allows player 2 to still hit other players while not making the issue of receiving damage behind cover worse. So once the ping of player 2 is higher than the configured threshold, his hit registration switches from client-side server authoritative to fully server-side, where the server won't compensate for the delay of player 2. This means that the only perspective that now matters is the one from the server, and where he sees player 1 when it receives the information about the shot that player 2 fired. This is how DICE tries to mitigate the issue where players with low pings die far behind cover, while still allowing players from all over the world to come together and play their game. Now, what affects your ping to the game server or your lag in general? One factor that you already know of is the distance between you and the game server. However, it is not possible to determine your ping by taking a map and drawing a straight line between your home and the location where the server is hosted. Because the copper and fiber optic cables take a very different route, and the data that you send to the server has to pass through multiple routers before it reaches the server. So when a router has to forward data, then it tries to use the best route. This means that when everything works as it should, then your data should take the shortest route to the game server. However, it can happen that a router either chooses a bad route or that it has to choose a worse one when the better one is down. Such can then lead to quite big detours for your data, which can also result in much higher pings and an increased risk of packet loss, since your data might have to pass through many more routers then. So when you suddenly notice a much higher ping to your favorite server, then this could be caused by the routing. In this case, you will then have to call your internet service provider so that they can check their routing tables. If you want to get the issue fixed faster, then you can provide them with traceroute data for that server. For that, you open the command prompt, type in traceroute and the IP of the game server that you have problems with. You will then get a list of all the hops between you and the game server with the ping between you and each of these hops. However, please be aware that depending on its configuration, a hop might not reply to your ICMP echo request or with a greater delay. The same is true for game servers where many do not reply when you try to ping them from the command prompt. So the length of the route that connects the client to the server and the amount of hops between them affects how long it takes data to reach its destination. This means that the lag that we experience in a game can never be lower than the travel time of the data, unless we figure out a way to break the laws of physics to speed up the electrons or photons that are used for the communication between the client and the server. What adds an extra delay on top of the travel time of our data is how frequently we send and receive it. So when we send and receive 30 updates per second, then there is more time between updates than when we send and receive 60. So by sending and receiving more updates per second, you can decrease the additional delay that is added on top of the travel time of your data. But where is that data coming from? This is where the term tick or simulation rate comes into play, which is how many times per second the game processes and produces data. So when you have a tick or simulation rate of 60, then this will cause less delay than when you use a tick rate of 30. A tick rate of 60 will also allow the server to send 60 updates per second. But not only the number of simulations that are done per second is important. It's also critical that the server finishes a tick as fast as possible, because at a tick rate of 60 Hz it only has a processing window of 16.66 milliseconds, inside which it must finish a simulation step. So at the beginning of a new tick, the server starts to process the data it received and runs its simulations. After that, it then sends the results to the clients and then sleeps until the next tick happens. The faster the server finishes a tick, the earlier the clients will receive new data from the server, which reduces the delays between players and makes the hit registration feel more responsive. This is something that I showed in my Battlefield 4 tests, where the net graph displays the time the server needs to finish a tick. So when it comes to the server's performance, then it's imperative that it finishes a simulation step as fast as possible, or at least inside the processing window that is given by the tick rate. When it gets close to that limit or even fails to process a tick inside that time frame, then you will instantly notice this, as that results in all sorts of strange gameplay issues like rubber banding, players teleporting, hits getting rejected, physics failing, etc. Now, what kind of options do developers have when it comes to the network model? One solution is that you pay hosters to set up dedicated servers for your games in their data centers, to which the players then connect to. This means that your game server is running on powerful hardware and the data center has enough bandwidth to handle all those players that connect to it. Also, when the matchmaking makes sure that all players have more or less the same ping to the game server, then you can avoid that some players have an unfair advantage in some situations or give players with low pings a bad experience. The downside of dedicated servers is that if you don't have a game that builds around the idea of the community running these servers, then the publisher or studio has to pay for them and they are quite expensive. Another challenge is that if you release your game worldwide, then you must also make sure that all players who buy the game have access to low latency servers. If you do not do that, then you create many players with high pings, and that is a problem for your entire community, not just the players who don't have servers near them. A different approach, which many people falsely refer to as peer-to-peer, is that you simply use the PC or console of one of the players to host the game, which means that he essentially becomes the server. With this solution, the game studio does not have to pay for expensive dedicated servers, and it also allows players located in a remote region to play with their friends at relatively low latency. One of the many downsides that this network model is suffering from is that the player who is also the server gets an advantage, because he has zero lag. This causes that he will see you before you see him, and he can fire at you before you can fire at him. Then we also have the problem that all players connect to the host through his consumer-grade internet connection, when in the worst case he could even use Wi-Fi. This frequently results in a lot of lag, packet loss, rubber banding, and an unreliable hit registration. But the most infuriating part of such a client-hosted match is the host migration, which is the process where the whole game pauses for several seconds while a different player is elected to replace the host that just left. Then we got the peer-to-peer network model, which you mostly see in 1v1 fighting games, but there are also a few other multiplayer games that have more than 2 players which use peer-to-peer. And since there are different variations of this network model, I will use For Honor as reference in this explanation. So in this network model we do not have a dedicated game server, nor is a client elected to host the match and run the simulation. However, we at least need a session host which takes care of invites and handshakes. That could be done by a dedicated server, or like in For Honor, a client is used for that task, which is also why the game will pause for several seconds until a new session host has been elected should the previous one leave. Another downside is that because every client runs its own simulation, the responsiveness of the hit registration might also vary depending on the ping of the player you engage. So when you fight a player to which you have a ping of 5 milliseconds, then the hit registration might feel better than when you engage a player to which you have a ping of 148 milliseconds. Or players with a high ping make the hit registration less responsive in general, as the clients keep their simulation in sync. Probably the biggest downside of this network model is security, as every game client knows and sees the WAN IP addresses of the other players. Besides that, there are a few other concerns that this peer-to-peer network model has in common with client-hosted matches, like the impact of underpowered hardware used by the players, as well as the players' consumer-grade internet connection, as all clients talk to each other to keep their simulation in sync. And anti-cheat is also always a very big concern in games that do not have an authoritative game server. So even though dedicated game servers do not magically provide 100% lag-free connections, I believe that they offer the best possible experience in online multiplayer games where you have more than 2 players participating in a match. Now, before I show you the results of my tests, I want to explain how I measure the delay that 2 players are affected by in a multiplayer game. To test this, I use a high-speed camera, 2 PCs where each of them has its own fiber internet connection, and a 144Hz gaming monitor on which the game runs at more than 144 FPS with all graphic options set to the lowest value. To measure the delays between the players, I point my high-speed camera at the monitors and then have player 2 shoot 20 times at player 1. Inside the high-speed recording, I then look for the frame where I see that player 2 starts to fire, and then I count the frames until I see that the damage was received by player 1, which is indicated by either blood splatter, a damage indicator, or the update of the health indicator, depending on what happens first and what is available in the game. In addition to this damage delay test, I also check the delay of the gunfire animation, as well as the movement delay. Now let's talk about the beta of Quake Champions and the current state of its netcode. First of all, I was very happy to find out that the developers decided to use dedicated game servers. I was concerned that they might go for client-hosted matches, as Quake Champions is going to be a free-to-play game. The beta currently provides servers in 15 different locations, and the game will automatically just select those locations to which you have a decent ping. You can, however, select and deselect locations yourself, but the game does currently not allow you to connect to a server to which you have a ping of more than 110 milliseconds. Now let's have a look at the update rates. The network data captured with Wireshark shows that every 16 milliseconds I receive an update from the game server, which means that it is sending a steady stream of 60 updates per second. The rate at which a client sends updates to the server looks a bit different though, because with just 4 to 4.5 milliseconds between data packets, my client sent 220 updates per second to the server when I captured this network data. However, while the server sends data at a steady 60 Hz, the rate at which the client sends its data is not locked at 220 Hz. As you can see here in this example where the time between updates sent by the client is 16 milliseconds. And so the client sent just 60 updates per second, not 220. This is because the rate at which the client sends data to the server is linked to the frame rate at which the game is running. So when the game runs at 50 FPS, then the client will send 50 updates per second to the server, while at a frame rate of 294 it will send 294 updates to the server and so on, which is true for both public and private matches. Now, how does that affect the game? When the time between updates is shorter, then this decreases the delay between the client and the server, which is good. However, a higher update rate also means that there is more traffic. So, when the game runs at about 180 to 210 FPS, then it sends about 300 to 320 kilobits per second to the server. When I then lock the frame rate at 60, then this does not only lower the send rate to 60 Hz, it also reduces the upstream traffic from 300 to 100 kilobits per second. Now, 300 kilobits per second does not sound like much. However, packets per second can become a limiting factor before the available bandwidth. When this happens, then you will run into gameplay issues like rubber banding, which has been reported by quite a few people who participate in the Quake Champions beta. When you run into this issue, then you need to reduce the rate at which your client sends data, and the only way to do that at the moment is by limiting your frame rate. Sadly, the game does not yet provide a built-in FPS limiter, which means that you need to use a tool like the RiverTuner statistics server. You can find a link to that tool in the description down below. Now, let's take a look at the delay that two players experience when they play on the same server. I run each of my delay tests 20 times as I explained in the basic section of this video. What I did not mention there is that I also repeat these tests on multiple servers to make sure that the results are consistent across multiple runs. Now, the reason why it took me so long to finish this video were not the disconnects that I encountered during custom matches. I mean, they didn't really help, but it wasn't the primary reason. What made the testing very time-consuming was that the delayed results differed greatly on a server-to-server basis. And that was despite making sure that the frame rate, the ping and the update rates were the same in every test run. So in the end, I did not only do 20 tests per test case, I also repeated these on 10 different servers. So with 144 FPS, which means that the client sends 144 updates per second to the server, and at a ping of 25 milliseconds to the server, I measured 45.25 milliseconds for the damage delay, 47.25 milliseconds for the gunfire delay, and 46.25 milliseconds for the movement delay. These would be great results if the game could achieve them consistently, but sadly these are the best ones out of the 10 test runs. In the worst test run, I measured a delay of 89.75 milliseconds for damage, 89.75 milliseconds for the gunfire, and 91.75 milliseconds for the movement delay. Again, in all test runs the game was running at the same frame rate, the ping to the server was 25 milliseconds, and I checked the update rates with Wireshark. So none of these factors could have caused the delay differences between the test runs. To me, it looks like the game either has some serious networking issues left, or that there is a big problem with the server performance, which causes that the game can go from super responsive to what the hell is going on here from one match to the next. This is most likely why many players say that they can't get a consistent gameplay experience in the beta, which is really not a surprise when the delays can vary that much between servers. Another thing that I noticed while reviewing the recorded high-speed footage was that even though I always fired just one shot, the other player always saw me firing 2 shots. Now, this is by no means a game-breaking issue, as you will most likely never notice this when you play the game. However, it might point towards an issue in the game that could also lead to other problems that are very well noticeable. So I think that the developers should look into this to see what is causing it and if it might also cause other bigger problems. Speaking of gameplay problems, how does Quake Champions deal with the issue where a player with a low ping receives damage far behind cover just because he got shot by a player whose ping to the server is very high? Now, as I mentioned before, I could not play on data centers to which I have a ping of more than 110 milliseconds. However, that does not guarantee that all players will always have a ping of under 110 milliseconds, because network congestion can cause sudden ping spikes of more than 300 milliseconds at any time during the match, unless you have a router that prioritizes data from real-time applications like the Edge Router series from Ubiquiti does. So, when the shooter has a ping of 250 milliseconds, then he does not have to lead his shot or do anything else to compensate for his high ping. The game will just send the hit to the player with the low ping, who then receives it far behind cover. The rocket launcher and possibly other projectile-based weapons behave a bit differently though, because with these the shooter must lead his shot to compensate for his high ping, as these weapons seem to be handled fully server-side. As a result, the 25 milliseconds player does not receive that hit far behind cover. So, after I finished testing the current beta of Quake Champions, I thought about what I would like to see the developers work on in the near future. Most important is, in my opinion, a consistent network or server performance, because when the delays vary as much as they do right now, then this results in a less than pleasant gameplay experience. Also critical for the online experience is that the game is able to change the update rates in order to avoid issues, like Battlefield 1 and Overwatch are able to. Another important feature is a built-in frame rate limiter, which has to allow players to choose from different presets or dial in a specific frame rate value, which is very important for gamers who own a G-Sync or FreeSync display. And lastly, it would be great to have network performance icons, which tell the player when his connection to the server has problems like packet loss, a lot of latency variation, or just a too high ping in general. So, I hope that you enjoyed this netcode analysis of the current Quake Champions beta, and I will keep you updated on the changes that the developers do to the networking and the servers of this game. If you like this kind of content where I take a look at the inner workings of video games and show you how these affect your experience, then you can help me to cover the costs of this channel by supporting me on Patreon. The link is in the description below. Also, if you want to stay up to date on what I'm currently working on, then you can follow me on Twitter or Facebook, the links are also in the description of this video. And if you don't want to miss the next one, then you might want to subscribe to my channel and click on that bell icon below this video to receive a notification when I upload the next one. So, if you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like, subscribe for more, and I hope to see you next time. Until then, have a nice day and take care. My name is Chris and this was Battle Nonsense.